Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just gonna wait a minute or so, just for people to come and tune in, um, and then we'll get started, inshallah. Um, just a few more seconds now, I think. Okay, I think we'll start now. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You're probably, as a lot of people around the world, they're probably very acutely aware of Sudan and also thinking at the same time, like, what is going on there? Like, there is so much stuff that we personally don't know in terms of history and in terms of what is currently happening and why is it so important for us Muslims anywhere in the world, but especially in places like UK and generally in the West, why is it important for people like us to support them? And how does this relate to other sort of revolutions or coups or everything else that we've seen in past decades on that continent? And I thought, whilst trying to explain why is it that they need our help, I thought I'll explain what is happening in Sudan right now, or rather, why is Sudan seeing protests, and why are things have only a few weeks ago we were talking about like Sudanese protesters, the leaders of the revolution, as well as their people. They're victorious. Why is this now descending into violence, and why is it that essentially there is a complete crackdown on these protesters, whilst before it was almost as if the country was in transition? And I guess we have to first understand our history, and like this is like history is just so important. As a side note, history is just so important for us to be able to understand the world at large, and even to understand our roles as Muslims in this world, as well as obviously in this country. And when we look at the history of Sudan, it is a relatively new country, so it has only been in existence for about 50 years. Yeah, in the 30 years of its history, however, in the latter 30 years of its history, it's been ruled by one dictator, Omar al-Bashir, and over that time, what he has done is, in order to sustain power, like many dictators and many autocrats do, they use scapegoating, divide and rule, especially when the economy is going bad and people start to feel uncomfortable and they start to demand better. The classic tactic is to essentially use military, militia, tactics, as well as sort of use the classic card of tyranny of the majority, um, and to try and to pit the majority against the minority who they wish to scapegoat and blame for their problems. Okay, and this is exactly what al Bashir did. And anybody who knows about the Darfur massacre knows exactly what he's capable of. So he is a tyrant by any sort of measure of any dictator that we've seen, especially very recently on the continent and in the region at large. So, and particularly when it came to Darfur, he like the majority of that country is Muslim, okay? But what he did, and he did it successfully, he managed to essentially favor the Arab Muslim majority over the African Muslim minorities. Okay, so not only is he's not playing religious lines, as people said, like in the past with the split of Sudan. In that time, he's used ethnic lines and divided Muslim brothers and sisters amongst themselves. And his key instrument for that was the Janjaweed, okay, who he gave at the time armed he armed them and he gave them air support throughout that whole massacre. Okay, so that's the past. But over that time, those divisions sustained, and they led to other forms of like microaggressions and discriminations and so on. And the economy overall waned, and the deterioration of the countries just got worse and worse and worse and worse. So what happened recently is that there has been a big push for to unite all types of populations, Arab and non-Arab, under a narrative of that we deserve a better future for our country. That's essentially the core message that they've united. This movement has united. So, and they deliberately have done that because they wanted to get rid of the divisions which the regime was built its power upon. Okay, so. So they did that, and they called for al-Bashir to resign, and that's happened. And you've seen another interim sort of president who is obviously part of the military take over, and now this crackdown's happening. Okay, so just to give you a kind of an update, and these are not accurate numbers, but just to give, and the reason why they're not accurate is because there's since the crackdown, there is so much information that has struggled to get out of the country. So but these are like almost the at least of the beginning of this week, the numbers that have sort of come out in the press. So we're talking about at least 500 people killed. Of those, if not more, 118 of those bodies have been simply dumped in the Nile and then found. Okay, we're talking about 723 people injured, and 650 of those arrested. Yeah, without any charge and any sort of judicial sort of process. We've had reported of 54 people at least raped, and that includes men and children as well, and thousands have gone missing. Okay, so there is complete and utter chaos. And the people who are doing this were the same people who led on the Darfur massacre, the people that lead the Janjaweed. Yeah, and this is another lesson: is that like there was clear genocide happening, and yet a lot of the Arabs there, they talked about how they tried to defend the actions of the Arab leaders because essentially because they're Arabs. But it was clear that Arabs were massacring African Muslims in order to essentially sustain its own power. And now it's not surprising that the same people who terrorized those people are now terrorizing Arabs, Muslims as well. Yeah, in order to save the regime. Okay, and that's the lesson: is that you have to, whenever there is injustice anywhere, that's going to come to your doorstep eventually if you are not playing a role to stop it. That obviously educate yourself, know the facts, know what's happening, who's the good guys, who's the bad guys. Yeah, but it is an imperative that you can never ignore, especially as a Muslim. But on practical terms, you can never ignore injustice, because that injustice will have to grow in order to survive. And that means that oppression is going to come to your doorstep eventually, and that's what's happened with the Janjaweed. What's also interesting is that the tactics of the protesters has, in response to this, has been that they are calling for peaceful action and civil disobedience across the country, and they're doing what they can, despite the suffering, despite the violence, to allow this this movement to be preserved, and not to send it into another Syria or another Egypt. And we've even seen Sudanese military. This is reported by Middle East Eye. We've even seen Sudanese military officers refusing to follow orders to use violence against these protesters, and in doing so, they have been arrested and detained as well. Okay, so what you're seeing is that there's a broad base of alliance and agreement that Sudan needs a civil government, and the people that are getting in the way are the people who essentially benefit from the dictator from the dictatorship that we see today. Okay, in fact, it's gotten so bad for the regime. Other regional dictators, especially the sponsor of tyrants of today in the region, Saudi and UAE, have stepped up their support for the regime. Okay, and when you know that something's really iffy, and it's also desperate when Saudi and UAE are getting involved, and they're supporting a person and a regime that is has a history of violence. Okay, and that's a clear indication of what is going on there. So Sudan is currently under internet blackout. So you won't hear a lot of stuff coming through as you have done in the previous weeks for that. So some footage that we want to see and like updates of what's happening and stats and facts and the trend of things. That's going to be harder for people to get out to the real world, and that's why we must not be silent ourselves. Okay, their voice has been silenced because the obviously like the blackout means that they can't get their voices across. Okay, and that means that for those who want to see a peaceful and brighter future for places like Sudan, yeah, it means that we need to be their voices instead. We need to be their global voice, especially on social media. Yeah, that's the basic thing that we should do. Okay, everybody has access to social media channels. They should do their research. I'm not asking you to just simply follow the crowd, yeah, or to jump on the bandwagon. Do your research, yeah. But it should be clear that these protesters honestly want a transition to a regime that is going to work for the people, not just an elite. Okay, and so yeah, I mean, that's the most basic thing that everybody should be doing. Just keep the conversation alive. Do not stop talking about it. Because as long as we are talking about this in outside of Sudan, those protesters have leverage and support to keep that conversation going on inside Sudan. Okay, so but there's more that we can do, and like like just one example for us in the West, yeah, the EU sends money to Sudan to the regime to stop African migrants coming to Europe. Now there's issues with that. That's all dodgy stuff, yeah. Basically, they're sending money to Sudan to make sure that certain migrants do not go to Europe, yeah, and obviously they're migrants of a certain color. Yeah, let's not let's not bounce around the bush about that. It's essentially they're sending Sudan to do their dirty work. Okay, but even that they're not doing that well. Okay, and we should use that as a means to pressure Sudan to do the right thing by calling on the EU to cut that funding. Just cut it. Yeah, there's no need for that to happen in the first place. And yet, even now, like that can be used as a pressure, as a lever for lobbying the Sudanese regime to just stop what they're doing. The game is over. Okay, so that's definitely one thing. But there's definitely for us to in our respective countries to call upon our governments to pursue diplomatic channels, especially when it comes to spaces like the UN. Yeah. Now, the UN is at most a good talking shop. It's not very good at doing. Yeah. But what they are good at is keeping that conversation alive when it comes to certain issues. That at least the UN is useful for, and we should use that avenue when it comes to trying to support these dictators as well. Sorry, the protesters as well against the dictatorship. Okay, so like those are just two things, and like if all of us do just those two things, and if we do it persistently and relentlessly, then we will essentially give them the support that they need. Okay, and if we do it collectively, then it will be extremely hard for the regime to have to explain itself, to force itself to explain itself, and it will also give platform for people who may or may not, who may be outside of the country, support like other Sudanese expats who had to flee the country and so on, to essentially give them a voice to keep to talk about what's happening there, to keep the topic on the agenda. Yeah, and no revolution doesn't experience any progress without a counter revolution. What you have now is the counter revolution. Okay, and this is critical. This is the most critical part, as I said in a previous Facebook Live on this issue, is absolutely critical. And if they don't get this support now, then we shouldn't be surprised that there's not only going to be a collapse of the revolution, but an absolute massacre and genocide on people who try to bring that the regime down to its knees. Okay, so just to finish off, um, this our just to summarize, our main priority of support is to keep that conversation alive. By doing so, we keep the agenda of their freedom alive, and it's that simple. Just keep talking about it, yeah, and find any means to do so. Whether you've got YouTube accounts, whether you've got Facebook or Instagram and so on, just the spread the word and create that noise. Okay, so if you have any other ideas of how we can help, or if you've got any questions about the situation, please just post below, I'll try my best to answer them. But just to finish off, some of you donated Ramadan and our Ramadan appeal just passed. And as promised, with some of the rewards that people have donated for, I want to sort of give my thanks and give a shout out to some of them. So, some of the names that donated, big thank you to Zara Chowdhury, Ahmed Zamir, Ahmed Wadood, Ayman Al Baalawi. Apologies if I didn't say that properly. Rabia Ishaq, Afan Iqbal, Qaisa Sharif, and Yasser Sharif. Our appeal is still going, so if you do like what we're saying and what we're doing, and inshallah you'll see more of that over the coming year. Please do continue to donate to us. I'll post a link of our appeal just below. Jazakallah again for listening. This has been a bit of a long one, but it's been a bit of a complicated situation, and but we'll keep you updated on the page. So keep following our page of what's happening in Sudan and elsewhere in the world. Assalamu alaikum.